We really do a terrible job of that in this society. And that's a big problem because for a democracy, it's not enough to know what the leaders are doing. You really have to know what the voters are doing. And that is a particular issue in communities of color where media coverage generally looks for shortcuts. So, and as you're about to see in the LA mayor's race with Karen Bass joining, there's going to be something called the Black vote, the Latino vote, the Jewish vote, the white conservative vote, as if everybody goes to a meeting and at that meeting they all agree at a convention on everything they're going to do. And it's not like a card game where you play a card with a particular group. The biggest problem we had in the recall is that if you followed the media coverage of the recall, which of course you were all involved in, you know that the interpretation of how communities of color voted changed by the hour. And the reason it changed by the hour is because people have no patience for an in-depth look at how communities vote. So they wanted an answer. This is a very, very big problem. For one thing, the coverage of California communities of color is driven too much by national polling, because national polling is what the national networks work off of. And then that filters its way down into the coverage throughout the country. And as you can imagine, when you draw a national survey on a quick hit, a quick overnight survey, you're going to have a relatively small number of Latinos, a small number of African Americans, a small number of people from the AAPI community without much depth. And it can be very unrepresentative. When I first read that Latinos were going to vote for the recall, I thought I'd lost my mind. I mean, there can't be any other data to support that. But in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed are kings. When we're not getting exposed to a lot more information, people grab whatever is out there. There are people who still think that George W. Bush won almost 50% of the Latino vote in 2004 because of a poll or two that probably wasn't accurate. A deep dive into the voting behavior and preferences of communities of color in California is the first step to reversing this syndrome of national media drawing conclusions that just change everybody's view of the world. And in fact, what it can end up doing is affect political party strategies. Now, I'm not saying you all have to invest in polling, but it pays to get off the crazy train of ethnic communities as playing cards that have a particular point of view. I also think it's disturbing where they interview what they call a typical Latino voter or a typical African American voter. Now, with the vast numbers of these communities we're talking about, there are no typical voters in that area, and it's very easy to give them extra strength. It is also easier for journalism to give strength to what they used to call the dog that doesn't bark. In other words, the one that goes against the narrative frame. So if you have a community, say the Jewish community, that is like 8-1 Democratic, the one that's not Democratic is the most likely one to get interviewed, because that's the dog that didn't bark. And then when you have conversations in the community, people say, oh my God, I can't believe half the community is voting for Donald Trump. So this happens in the Latino vote. It's also the reason why the only ethnic community we know anything about in this country is the world's most overstudied community, which is white undecided voters. You would think that white undecided voters are the largest community in the United States, followed by white Trump voters, who are studied nonstop, but we don't study everybody else. They're not the dog, they're the dog that doesn't bark. I would actually say I'm as interested in why people vote as why people don't vote. Just as I'm interested in why people get vaccinated, as much as I'm interested in why people don't get vaccinated. What you study reinforces people's behavior. You want your media to be a mirror where people can see themselves. And not everybody is a non-voter, not everybody is an anti-vaxxer, et cetera. The great majority of people aren't talking about it, but they have a point of view that's worth studying. So I'm not here to tell you that everybody has to start their own poll. I am saying liberate yourselves from narratives that are driven by a very small number of largely national polls that are creating, I think, very negative consequences for the interpretation of communities' behavior. And I think it starts here. It starts with getting to know neighborhoods. And as again, not to get ahead of the story, but you'll see in some of the data you're going to hear, to know a neighborhood where a group is predominant can tell you a whole lot about a community, probably more than a national CNN poll with 10 people from California in it.